The fight ended without controversy. No protest, no investigation. The referee raised a hand, the doctor stepped in, and the paperwork was signed. On every official record, it was a clean, approved UFC bout. Nothing about that night suggested a mistake had been made. But the damage didn't end when the bell rang. No rule was broken. The fighter passed his medical exams. He was licensed, cleared, and officially approved to compete. The UFC did exactly what the system allowed it to do. And that is why this story matters. Because when everything is done by the book, responsibility doesn't vanish. It becomes invisible. In MMA, risk is often framed as personal choice. Fighters know what they're signing up for. They accept the danger. But that argument only works if the system understands when risk turns into certainty. And in this case, it didn't. Not when the warning signs were obvious. Not when the damage had already been stacking up. Not when one more fight could turn a career into a life sentence. This fighter wasn't reckless. He didn't defy doctors. He didn't sneak past regulations. He trusted the system designed to protect him. Each time he was told he was fit to compete, he heard permission. And permission, in a violent sport, carries more weight than caution ever could. He wasn't banned. He wasn't suspended. He wasn't told to stop. He was approved again and again until the consequences became permanent. Long after the crowd left, long after the event moved on, long after the paperwork was filed and forgotten. Years later, the cost surfaced slowly, in speech that no longer flowed, in memory that no longer held, in a life that no longer worked the way it once had, not because of one illegal decision, but because of a series of legal ones. His name is Spencer Fisher. He never sued. He never accused the UFC of wrongdoing. He simply admitted the truth too late. He should have stopped fighting long before the system stopped him. This video is not about blame. It's about approval, and how a system can do everything right and still destroy someone. By the time Spencer Fisher stepped toward the cage, the most important decision of the night had already been made. Not by him, not by his opponent, but by a system that had reviewed his history, scanned his recent fights, checked the boxes, and concluded he was fit to compete. The bell had not rung yet, but permission had already been granted. In professional MMA, clearance is power. It's the moment where risk becomes acceptable. Medical records are reviewed, suspensions are checked, doctors test vision, balance, reflexes, and basic neurological response. Athletic commissions verify eligibility. Promoters submit contracts. When every step is completed, a fight doesn't just happen, it's authorized. And authorization carries an assumption that whatever follows is an acceptable outcome. Fisher's clearance wasn't rushed. It wasn't a loophole. It wasn't a mistake. It was the result of a process doing exactly what it was designed to do. That's what makes this story uncomfortable, because the system didn't fail to act. It acted precisely as intended. The problem is what the system measures and what it ignores. Clearances are built to answer short-term questions. Can the fighter see clearly today? Can he respond appropriately right now? Can he protect himself tonight? Those answers can be yes, even when long-term damage is already unfolding, especially in fighters known for toughness, especially in fighters who have learned to mask pain, push through fog, and perform under stress. Fisher had that reputation: durable, willing, reliable. He showed up, made weight, passed exams, and fought. To the system, that looked like stability. To his body, it was accumulation. There was no single test that said, stop. No dramatic result that forced intervention. Instead, there were fragments, hard fights, heavy shots, short recovery windows, each explainable on its own. None of them crossed the line alone. Together, they formed a trajectory the system wasn't designed to confront. And so the answer stayed the same: cleared. This is where responsibility becomes abstract. Doctors assess symptoms in a narrow window. Commissions follow written standards. Promoters schedule what is legally permissible. No single person feels like they are ending a career. They are just approving the next step. And when everyone is only responsible for a piece, no one is responsible for the outcome. Fisher didn't deceive anyone. He didn't hide injuries. He trusted the approvals around him. When he was told he was fit to compete, he heard reassurance. In a sport built on endurance, reassurance is powerful. By the time the cage door closed, the clearance had done its job. The system had spoken. What happened next would be considered acceptable because it was allowed. And once permission is given, stopping becomes much harder than continuing. By the time Spencer Fisher was cleared again, the risk was no longer abstract. It was already documented. Not as one catastrophic injury, but as a pattern, the kind combat sports quietly learn to live with. Fisher's career was built on absorbing punishment. He didn't glide through fights. He took shots, stayed upright, and kept coming forward. Fans admired it. Matchmakers relied on it. Over time, that reputation became its own justification. If a fighter keeps standing, the assumption follows: he can keep going. But damage doesn't need to knock you down to count. Long before his final appearances, Fisher had endured repeated head trauma, hard exchanges, heavy knockouts, limited recovery windows that looked acceptable on a schedule but brutal on a nervous system. None of this was hidden. It was visible in fight footage, recorded in results, and known to anyone tracking his career. The danger wasn't secret, it was normalized. That normalization is the turning point. In MMA, single events are easy to excuse. One bad loss is a bad night. 2 can be matchup issues. Even 3 can be framed as bad luck. What's harder to confront is accumulation, the way damage stacks quietly, until one more sanctioned fight pushes the brain past a threshold it can't recover from. Medical clearances aren't built to measure that threshold. Doctors evaluate the present, not the trajectory. Can he answer questions? Can he balance? Can he protect himself right now? Those answers can all be yes, even when long-term decline has already begun, especially in disciplined fighters who know how to mask symptoms and push through fog. And Fisher did exactly that. There's another uncomfortable reality the sport rarely admits. Fighters almost never stop themselves. Careers don't end because athletes suddenly feel unsafe. They end when bodies refuse to cooperate or when the system intervenes. In Fisher's case, the system never did. It saw enough function to proceed, and that was enough. What makes this moment critical isn't hindsight, it's admission. Years later, Fisher would say he should have stopped much earlier. That single sentence reframes everything. It confirms the fighter was relying on external judgment, on approvals, on permissions, on the belief that if it was allowed, it must be acceptable. But allowed is not the same as safe. The system knew he had taken punishment. It knew the pattern. It knew the exposure. What it didn't do was act on that knowledge in a way that prevented further harm. Each warning sign was treated as insufficient alone. Together, they were ignored. No one had to say, "This will end badly." They only had to keep saying yes. And once you recognize that, the story shifts. This isn't about a single bout. It's about what happens when visible risk becomes routine and approval becomes automatic. Next, we move into the fight itself. Not to sensationalize it, but to understand the moment when accumulated risk stopped being theoretical and became irreversible. When Spencer Fisher stepped into the cage, nothing about the matchup felt extraordinary. No title, no rivalry, no warning that this night would be different. That ordinariness was the danger, because the most irreversible damage in combat sports doesn't arrive with drama. It arrives inside fights that look routine. From the opening exchanges, the pattern was familiar. Pressure forward, trades in the pocket, a willingness to take shots to land his own. This was the identity that had defined his career. It had earned him respect, contracts, and opportunities. But now it carried a different cost. Every impact landed on a system already carrying years of accumulated stress. There wasn't a single moment when the fight turned. No obvious collapse. No instant that forced a mandatory stoppage. Instead, there were seconds that added up. Shots that snapped the head back. Resets that took a fraction longer. Reactions that dulled just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be disqualifying. To the crowd, it was action. To officials, it was still competition, and so it continued. This is the hardest truth to confront. The fight did not break the rules. The referee didn't ignore a clear signal. The corner didn't commit a visible error. Everyone involved stayed within accepted standards. That's precisely why the outcome matters. Because when a system waits for obvious failure before it intervenes, it often acts only after the line has already been crossed. By the time the fight ended, there was no spectacle. He wasn't carried out. He didn't collapse. He stood, answered questions, and walked away. On the surface, it looked like another completed bout, another successful approval. But something had changed. What happened in that cage wasn't a sudden injury. It was a tipping point. The moment when accumulated damage stopped being manageable and became permanent. The line between recoverable and irreversible is thin, and it doesn't announce itself. Once it's crossed, there is no replay, no appeal, no undo. The bell rang. The event moved on. The broadcast cut to highlights. For the system, the job was done. For the fighter, the consequences were only beginning quietly, invisibly, away from cameras and crowds. Because the fight itself wasn't the failure. It was the final step. The real damage didn't show up under the lights. It surfaced later, in the quiet that follows a sanctioned fight. When the arena emptied and the event moved on, the system considered its job finished. The bout was complete. The approval had worked. There was nothing left to review. For the fighter, everything changed. At first, the signs were easy to dismiss. Words came out slower. Thoughts took longer to organize. Memory slipped in small, deniable ways. In a sport built on pain tolerance, discomfort is always rationalized before it's confronted. Fatigue, stress, age, anything but consequence. There was no follow-up mechanism designed to catch what came next. No long-term protocol tracking cognitive decline after clearance is granted. Once a fight ends without immediate catastrophe, responsibility dissolves. The organization moves forward. The commission moves on. The paperwork closes. Whatever surfaces later is treated as personal misfortune, not systemic outcome. That's the blind spot. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They accumulated. Daily tasks became harder. Speech lost its rhythm. Memory stopped cooperating. The kind of damage that doesn't create headlines, but quietly reshapes a life. By the time it could no longer be ignored, there was no single moment to point to, no fight to overturn, no decision to reverse, only a trail of approvals that all made sense at the time. Years later, the truth finally surfaced, not through an investigation, but through an admission. He said he should have stopped fighting much earlier. That single sentence reframed everything, because it confirmed what the system never acknowledged. Permission is not protection. He didn't lose everything in one night. He lost it because no one ever told him to stop. In the final section, we step back from the individual story and examine the logic that allowed this to happen not once, but as a repeatable outcome. Because this wasn't a broken rule. It was a working system. What happened to Spencer Fisher wasn't the result of a reckless call or a single bad decision. It was the outcome of a system doing exactly what it was built to do: keep moving. At the highest level of MMA, approvals are shaped by momentum. Fights are scheduled months ahead. Cards need to be filled. Replacements are costly. Broadcast windows are fixed. Once a fighter passes medical exams and is licensed, the default answer becomes yes. Stopping a bout creates friction. Allowing it keeps everything on track. That logic doesn't require bad intent. It only requires efficiency. Within Ultimate Fighting Championship, responsibility is spread thin by design. Doctors are asked to assess short-term fitness, not long-term outcomes. Athletic commissions enforce written standards, not future consequences. Promoters book what is legally permissible. Each role is insulated from the final result. No one feels like they're ending a career, they're just approving the next fight. And that's the flaw. Because long-term neurological damage doesn't show up in ways that force immediate intervention. It doesn't fail a reflex test on fight week. It doesn't invalidate a license overnight. It reveals itself years later, when the approvals are forgotten and the consequences are permanent. By the time the system can no longer deny it, there's nothing left to stop. This is why the fight was allowed. Not because the risk was unknown, but because it wasn't disqualifying. The warning signs existed, but they weren't decisive. And in a system that only stops when it's forced to, ambiguity always favors continuation. Everything was legal, everything was approved, and everything still went wrong. This story isn't about one fighter or one promotion. It's about what happens when permission is mistaken for protection, when approval becomes routine, when responsibility becomes abstract, and when the cost of that abstraction is paid by the person with the least power to refuse. Because sometimes the most damaging decision isn't a reckless one. It's a reasonable one repeated until there's nothing left to protect. There was no scandal at the end of this story. No courtroom, no headline admitting failure. Because nothing illegal ever happened. The fight was approved, the rules were followed, the system moved on. And that's the point. Spencer Fisher didn't lose everything because someone broke the rules. He lost everything because the rules never told anyone to stop. Approval replaced judgment, permission replaced protection, and by the time the cost became visible, it was already irreversible. Combat sports will always involve risk. That isn't the question. The question is what happens when risk becomes predictable and the system still says yes, when warning signs are documented, normalized, and quietly accepted as the price of doing business. This story isn't about blaming a fighter or accusing an organization. It's about understanding how damage can be authorized without ever being acknowledged, how loss can be approved on paper, and how the most dangerous word in this sport isn't knockout, it's cleared. Cleared. Because once a system gets used to saying yes, it forgets how to stop, and when it finally does, there's usually nothing left to save.